By the time anyone stopped him, Charles Cullen had worked at 10 different hospitals in 16 years. 4 of those hospitals had already suspected him. Co-workers had quietly warned each other. Supervisors had noticed the pattern and moved him along instead of calling the police. Nobody wanted the lawsuit. Nobody wanted to be wrong. So instead, a man prosecutors believe may have killed more people than almost anyone in American history simply kept getting hired. He never needed to hide. The uniform did that for him. Tonight, we're looking at 6 nurses across 4 countries and 3 decades who used the one relationship patients are never supposed to question, the person standing over their hospital bed, to kill. Some killed for years before a single person raised an alarm. Others were finally stopped only because one co-worker refused to look away, even when it meant risking their own job to do it. One of tonight's cases doesn't end with an arrest at all. It ends with the killer confessing voluntarily, unprompted, to a room full of strangers who had no idea what they were about to hear. But the final case tonight may be the hardest one to sit with. A nurse, trusted without question, working a ward where the patients were far too young to understand they should have been afraid. These stories come from court records, hospital investigations, and the colleagues and detectives who eventually pieced the pattern together, often years after they first suspected something was wrong. Let's start with the case that, to this day, remains one of the largest serial murder investigations medicine has ever seen. On the night detectives finally decided to move, they didn't send a SWAT team or stage a raid. They sent one exhausted, ailing nurse into a diner with a wire taped under her shirt and hoped her friend would tell her the truth over a beer, the same way he might have told her anything else. Charles Cullen was born on February 22nd, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children. His father, a bus driver, died when Charles was just 7 months old, before he could ever have known him. His mother died in a car accident when he was 17, and by his own account, hospital staff refused to let him see her body in the moments after the crash, a detail he would return to for the rest of his life. 2 of his siblings also died young. He would later spend years caring for a brother dying of cancer. Death, in one form or another, had surrounded Cullen since before he could remember any other kind of life, a childhood shaped more by funerals than birthdays. After dropping out of high school, Cullen enlisted in the Navy, serving aboard a nuclear submarine. His time in the service was troubled almost from the start. He attempted suicide more than once during those years, and was reportedly discharged well before completing a typical term of service. Afterward, he enrolled at Mountainside Hospital's nursing school in Montclair, New Jersey. Graduating in 1987, he married, had 2 daughters, and began work in the burn unit of St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. It was there, in June 1988, that Cullen later admitted he administered his first lethal overdose, injecting a patient with a fatal dose of intravenous medication. He would go on to confess to killing several more patients at St. Barnabas, including a man with AIDS who died after Cullen gave him an overdose of insulin. Cullen left the hospital in January 1992, right around the time administrators began investigating a string of contaminated IV bags. Investigators would later determine Cullen had most likely been responsible, a discovery that arrived only after he was already gone. This is the shape the rest of Cullen's career would take. Again and again, For 16 years, a hospital, a cluster of unexplained deaths, a quiet departure, and a fresh start somewhere else before anyone connected the two. He spent 3 years in the intensive care unit at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, where he received an employee award and later confessed to killing 5 more patients with digoxin overdoses between January and September of 1996. He moved briefly to Morristown Memorial Hospital, where he was fired for poor performance. Around this time, his marriage collapsed. His wife filed for divorce in January 1993 and told police she was afraid of him. After 6 months out of work and a stint in a psychiatric facility following a bout of depression, Cullen was hired in February 1998 at the Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where he staffed a ward of patients dependent on respirators, some of the most vulnerable people in the entire facility. From there, the pattern accelerated. Cullen moved through Eastern Hospital, then Sacred Heart Hospital in Allentown, then St. Luke's Hospital, then Lehigh Valley Hospital, each stop adding to a body count investigators would spend years trying to fully reconstruct. At more than one of these hospitals, colleagues noticed something was wrong well before anyone called the police. At Sacred Heart, a nurse who'd heard rumors about Cullen from Eastern Hospital quietly warned her co-workers not to trust him. At St. Luke's, administrators reportedly delayed acting on drug discrepancies, partly out of concern for the hospital's bond rating during an expansion project, prioritizing the institution's finances over reporting a staff member colleagues already suspected. At other facilities, staff informally tried to keep Cullen from being hired at all, making calls to warn other hospitals rather than filing any kind of formal report. It was, again and again, an open secret, kept just far enough below the surface to never trigger a real investigation. Part of the problem was structural. Nurses in New Jersey and Pennsylvania faced no mandatory requirement to report suspicions of misconduct to a licensing board, unlike doctors in many jurisdictions. Hospitals, meanwhile, worried constantly about liability. Firing a nurse over suspicion rather than proof invited a wrongful termination lawsuit. Giving a bad reference to another hospital invited a different one. So administrators did the quietest thing available to them. They let problem employees resign, sometimes citing something as minor as a falsified job application, and let the next hospital discover the problem on its own. At least 4 different institutions suspected Cullen, in one form or another, of harming patients before he was ever arrested. None of them called the police. 20 separate lawsuits would eventually be filed against these hospitals by the families of his victims. In September 2002, Cullen began working the critical care unit at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. His depression had continued to worsen, even as he started dating someone new. By the middle of 2003, investigators believe he had already killed at least 13 patients there and attempted to kill at least 1 more, again using digoxin, insulin, and epinephrine. On June 18th, he unsuccessfully tried to kill a patient named Philip Gregor, who was discharged and lived another 6 months before dying of unrelated natural causes. This time, though, the pattern that had protected Cullen for 14 years finally started to break down. Somerset's computerized drug dispensing system, known as Pyxis, tracked every medication request down to the minute. An electronic cabinet meant to prevent exactly this kind of theft. Hospital administrators noticed Cullen accessing the records of patients who weren't assigned to him. They noticed him requesting medications his patients had never been prescribed. Some orders placed and cancelled within minutes of each other. A pattern investigators later understood as an attempt to leave a thinner trail. A request opened and closed before the system logged an actual withdrawal. When investigators grew closer, Cullen adapted again, ordering large quantities of ordinary acetaminophen, which happened to share a supply drawer with digoxin, the same drug he'd used to kill for over a decade. It was Amy Loughran, reviewing those records later, who first noticed the substitution for what it really was. In July 2003, the executive director of the New Jersey Poison Information and Education System warned Somerset officials directly. At least 4 suspicious overdoses at the hospital suggested an employee might be deliberately killing patients. The hospital didn't act immediately. By October, Cullen had killed at least 5 more patients and attempted 1 more overdose. When a patient died of severe low blood sugar that same month, the hospital finally alerted the New Jersey State Police. That patient, a Somerset County man, would turn out to be Cullen's last victim. State officials would later criticize the hospital sharply for waiting as long as it did, particularly after learning Somerset had failed to report a separate non-fatal insulin overdose Cullen had administered back in August. On October 31, 2003, Somerset fired Cullen, officially for lying on his employment application, rather than for anything related to patient deaths. The criminal investigation that followed became, in the words of former Somerset County prosecutor Wayne Forrest, the largest homicide investigation the county, and possibly the state, had ever undertaken. Detectives needed an insider, someone who knew Cullen well enough to get him talking, and who understood the hospital systems well enough to make sense of the drug records. They found her in Amy Loughran, a fellow ICU nurse, and one of Cullen's closest friends at Somerset. Loughran was a single mother, quietly managing a serious heart condition of her own, something she'd confided in almost no one except Cullen. The two had bonded over shared struggles, divorced marriages, difficult daughters, long overnight shifts, the particular kind of closeness that forms between people doing exhausting, high-stakes work together. Cullen had gone out of his way to change his own schedule so the two of them worked every shift side by side, and colleagues sometimes joked about the close trio he, Loughran, and a third co-worker had formed on the unit. When detectives approached her, she was asked to review Cullen's Pyxis records herself. She noticed immediately that an ICU nurse had no obvious reason to be requesting medications typically used in the cardiac unit, and that his combination of orders made no clinical sense for any of his actual patients. Detectives asked her to do something far harder than reviewing paperwork. They asked her to meet Cullen for a casual afternoon drink, wearing a hidden recording device, and get him to admit what he'd done. Loughran agreed. At a bar in Bridgewater, New Jersey, she confronted her friend directly about the deaths. She would later describe the moment his demeanor changed instantly. He sat straight up, she recalled. The color of his eyes changed. He put a smirk on his face and said, "I'm going to go down fighting." Cullen was arrested at a restaurant on December 12, 2003. Initially charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of attempted murder tied to 2 Somerset patients. 2 days later, he began confessing. He told investigators he believed he had caused 30 to 40 deaths across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. though he said he could no longer remember many of the specifics. At his first court hearing, he told the judge plainly, "I am going to plead guilty. I don't plan to fight this." What followed was a methodical, county-by-county reconstruction of 16 years of hospital records, exhumations, and toxicology reports, an effort to identify as many victims as the evidence would allow. Cullen's public defender, Johnny Mask, later explained that cooperating with prosecutors to name victims was the primary reason Cullen avoided the death penalty. Over the following 2 years, Cullen pleaded guilty, count by count, across multiple counties in both states. 14 murders and 2 attempted murders in one New Jersey plea, 3 more shortly after, 6 more that November, and additional pleas in Pennsylvania. By the time the pleas concluded, Cullen had formally admitted to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders. Investigators and journalists who worked the case, including author Charles Graeber, believe the real number is almost certainly far higher, potentially in the hundreds, though a lack of surviving hospital records from his earliest years made most of those additional deaths impossible to prove in any courtroom. Cullen's sentencing, in March 2006, stretched across 2 tense hearings in 2 states. In Somerset County, Judge Paul Armstrong sentenced him to 11 consecutive life terms for 22 New Jersey murders and 3 attempted murders, telling him, "You betrayed the ancient foundations of the healing professions." Victims' families, some meeting Cullen face to face for the first time, stood at a lectern roughly 15 feet from where he sat and did not hold back. They called him vermin, garbage, and a monster who had shattered their trust in medicine entirely. One woman held up a photograph of her 89-year-old father, murdered in 2003, and said that after that day, she would finally toss aside Cullen's name and face like the garbage he was. Another mother, whose 21-year-old son had been Cullen's youngest confirmed victim, told the court she still walked around with a hole in her heart. Cullen sat through most of it with his eyes closed, offering no reaction. A week later, in Pennsylvania, Cullen was so disruptive during his own sentencing, repeating the phrase, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 30 straight minutes, that the judge had him gagged with cloth and duct tape. Even gagged, he kept trying to mouth the same words. He received additional consecutive life sentences there for the remaining Pennsylvania victims, pushing his total sentence past a dozen lifetimes, with no possibility of parole for centuries to come. Cullen told investigators, and later a national television audience, that he saw many of the killings as mercy, ending suffering for patients he believed were being kept alive artificially, in pain, with no real chance of recovery. The record didn't support that explanation nearly as often as he claimed. Reverend Florian Gall, one of his victims, had been recovering from pneumonia and improving before Cullen gave him a lethal dose of digoxin. 21-year-old college student John Strenko, another victim, was the youngest person Cullen is confirmed to have killed. Neither had been near death. Both had families who expected them to recover. Speaking to 60 Minutes years later, Cullen struggled even then to call what he'd done by its plain name. "I think that I had a lot of trouble accepting that word for a long time," he said, when asked whether he considered himself a murderer. "I accept that that's what it is." There was one final strange coda to the case. Shortly after his sentencing, Cullen offered to donate a kidney to the brother of a former girlfriend. a man he'd never harmed and barely knew. A judge set unusual conditions on the procedure, requiring it take place at a hospital certified by the Department of Corrections and that all costs be covered by insurance. And in August 2006, the surgery went ahead. The kidney was flown to a hospital in New York and successfully transplanted. Cullen's own attorney later said he suspected officials within the state's corrections system had quietly tried to prevent the donation from happening at all, uncomfortable with the idea of Cullen doing something that might read, to the public, as an act of genuine decency. What makes Cullen's case so difficult to sit with isn't only the scale, though the scale is almost impossible to comprehend on its own. It's the fact that the system built to catch someone like him simply wasn't built at all. No national database cross-referenced suspicious hospital deaths between institutions. No licensing requirement forced a nurse's suspicious departure to follow him to his next job. Hospitals, worried about their own legal exposure, chose silence over disclosure. Again and again, for 16 years, across 9 or more medical centers, Cullen didn't need to be clever to keep killing. He simply needed every individual hospital to prioritize its own liability over the next one's patients. And for 16 years, that's exactly what happened. It would take one nurse, risking her own health and her own career, wearing a wire into a bar to have a beer with a friend she'd trusted completely, to finally end it. Amy Lochran later said she needed to understand how she'd missed it, how she'd sat beside a man for months without ever seeing what he really was, how someone capable of so much harm could also be, in the smaller moments of an ordinary friendship, funny, gentle, and easy to talk to. It's a question that shows up again and again in cases like this one. Not how a killer manages to hide, but how completely trust itself becomes the perfect disguise. Charles Cullen may be the most prolific case America has ever produced, but he wasn't the largest serial murder conviction medicine would ultimately see. That distinction belongs to a nurse working thousands of miles away, in northern Germany, who didn't kill to end suffering at all. He did it, prosecutors would later argue, because he liked being the one who saved them. In August 2001, doctors and staff at a hospital in Oldenburg, Germany, held a meeting to discuss something troubling: a sharp, unexplained spike in cardiac emergencies and deaths on one particular ward over the preceding months. 58% of those incidents, they'd found, had happened while one specific nurse was on duty, a statistic that, laid out on paper, should have been almost impossible to ignore. That nurse was sitting in the room while they discussed it, listening to his own colleagues describe, out loud, a pattern that pointed directly at him. Nothing happened. He kept working there for another year, unremarked upon, unwatched. Then he moved to a second hospital and kept going for 3 more. Niels Högel was born on December 30th, 1976, in Wilhelmshaven, in northern Germany. His father worked as a nurse. His mother also had her own career outside the home, and by most accounts, his early life gave no obvious indication of what he would eventually become. Colleagues who worked alongside him in his 20s often described him as competent, likable, and reliable under pressure, exactly the kind of nurse a hospital would want on a high-acuity ward, someone patients' families felt reassured to see walk into the room. Away from work, Högel had a documented history of alcohol use that would later surface during the various investigations into his conduct. though it was never established as a direct cause of the killings themselves. In 1999, Högel took a position in the cardiac surgery intensive care unit of the Oldenburg Clinic, on a ward known internally as Ward 211, one of the most acute and closely monitored units in the entire hospital. Within roughly a year, according to police, he had killed his first patient. What Högel was doing wasn't complicated, and that was part of what made it so hard to catch. He would inject patients with unauthorized doses of medications, heart drugs like ajmaline, sotalol, and amiodarone, along with potassium and the anesthetic lidocaine, deliberately triggering a cardiac emergency. Then he would respond. He would call the crisis, rush in, and attempt to resuscitate the very patient he'd just poisoned, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, in front of exactly the audience he wanted watching. Prosecutors would later argue his motive was almost disarmingly simple. He wanted to be the hero of the room. He wanted colleagues to see him step in during chaos and save a life, even if the chaos itself was something only he had caused. There was no financial motive, no personal grievance against any specific patient, nothing that resembled a traditional criminal rationale at all. He would later describe his own compulsion in blunter terms, admitting the decisions were usually spontaneous and impulsive, and that after each death, he told himself he would never do it again, a resolve that reliably faded within days, sometimes hours. The August 2001 meeting wasn't the only warning sign the hospital had, though it may be the clearest one on record, but formal action didn't follow. In October 2002, just before Högel transferred to a new hospital, the Oldenburg Clinic's director of nursing wrote him a glowing reference letter, describing his work as circumspect, diligent, and autonomous, praising how he acted prudently and in an objectively correct manner in critical situations, and commending his devotedness and cooperative conduct. The letter concluded that he had completed his assigned duties to the utmost satisfaction. 2 months later, in December 2002, Högel began work at Delmenhorst Clinic, near Bremen, carrying that letter with him. The killings didn't slow down. If anything, they accelerated. Emergencies and fatalities linked to arrhythmia or sudden blood pressure crashes began spiking again, almost immediately after Högel arrived at Delmenhorst. This time badly enough that some of his own co-workers started quietly distancing themselves from him, even without any formal accusation on record. According to later court testimony, Högel had initially been well regarded at the new hospital too, at least until the same pattern that should have followed him from Oldenburg started to repeat itself in a new building, with new colleagues, and a new set of patients who had no idea what his arrival meant for their odds of leaving the ward alive. In July 2004, Högel's daughter was born. He would later admit that, in order to sustain what he described as the euphoria of new fatherhood, he injected a severely ill intensive care patient with a toxic agent during his very first shift back on duty after her birth, using one of the most significant days of his own life as, in effect, a trigger for someone else's death. It took until June 22, 2005, for someone to finally catch him in the act. Colleagues discovered Högel intentionally manipulating a patient's syringe pump to improperly administer ajmaline in real time. No inference or statistical pattern required, just a nurse watching another nurse tamper with a dying patient's medication in front of them. Even that direct, unambiguous discovery didn't produce an immediate response, and even then, the response was slow. The patient died the following day. Not a single supervisor, colleague, or staff member contacted police for 2 full days afterward, a delay that, in hindsight, cost at least one more life. That gap gave Högel enough time to kill one more patient. On June 24, 2005, his final confirmed victim before his arrest that summer. What followed was less a single trial than a slow, expanding series of them, each one uncovering more than the last, stretched out over more than a decade. In 2006, Högel was convicted of attempted manslaughter and given a 5-year sentence based only on what investigators could prove from the handful of incidents already documented at the time of his arrest. It was a modest sentence for what would eventually be revealed as one of the largest serial killing sprees in post-war German history. But at that point, nobody involved in the case understood the true scale of what they were looking at. On appeal in 2008, that conviction was revised and increased to 7.5 years, now incorporating an actual murder conviction alongside further attempts. It was only after that 2008 case drew national media attention, putting Högel's name and photograph in front of the public for the first time, that investigators began digging deeper into his full patient history across both hospitals, and the numbers began climbing in a way nobody had anticipated. During that renewed investigation, Högel admitted to 90 unauthorized injections in total, 30 of which had ended in death. In February 2015, a court in Oldenburg convicted him of 2 additional murders and 2 attempted murders, sentencing him to life in prison, on top of the sentence he was already serving. Prosecutors argued plainly, by this point, that boredom and a desire to show off his resuscitation skills to colleagues had driven the killings. That might have been the end of it, another life sentence stacked on top of the first. It wasn't. In October 2014, amid mounting suspicion that the true number of victims was far larger than anything proven so far, police launched a dedicated task force known internally as Special Commission Cardio, eventually identifying some 200 suspicious deaths connected to Högel's shifts at both hospitals. Investigators reviewed more than 500 patient files and hundreds of additional hospital records, cross-referencing staffing schedules against every unexpected cardiac event either hospital had logged across a 6-year period. Where possible, they exhumed bodies, ultimately digging up 134 sets of remains from 67 different cemeteries across Germany, testing for the specific cocktail of drugs Högel was known to favor. It was slow, grim, methodical work, the kind of investigation that measures progress in individual case files rather than headlines. The work ran into an obstacle no amount of diligence could overcome. At Delmenhorst alone, 101 patients who died during Högel's tenure had already been cremated, erasing any physical evidence of what killed them, permanently and completely. In many other cases, even where remains still existed, decomposition had progressed too far to detect any trace of medication at all, leaving investigators with nothing but suspicion and a timeline. Investigators were, in effect, racing against time that had already run out, years before they even knew to start looking. By November 2017, the number of deaths formerly attributed to Högel had climbed to 106. In January 2018, German prosecutors filed a new indictment charging him with 97 additional murders, and announced they intended to pursue charges against other hospital staff members who had failed to act on their own suspicions over the years. A rare and significant step in a country where prosecuting bystanders in a medical setting carries its own legal complications. Lead prosecutor Martin Koziolek later told reporters that while investigators suspected Högel's true total might run even higher, closer to 100 additional deaths, the evidence only firmly supported 97 of them. In the remaining handful of cases, he said, there may have been medical tampering, but nothing that could be proven to have directly caused a death. When his trial for those charges opened in October 2018, Högel did something unexpected. On the very first day, he confessed outright, admitting to killing patients between the ages of 34 and 96 across both hospitals between 2000 and 2005. The confession didn't shorten the proceedings much. Over the following 8 months, the court worked through each of the 100 counts individually, weighing exhumation results, staffing records, and medical testimony case by case, aware that whatever it decided would likely stand as the final, definitive accounting of Högel's crimes. The final verdict came on June 6, 2019. The Oldenburg court found Högel guilty of 85 of the 100 murder counts against him, acquitting him on the remaining 15 only for lack of provable evidence, largely due to the cremations and decomposition that had destroyed the underlying proof. Presiding Judge Sebastian Biermann did not mince words as he handed down another life sentence. "Your guilt is incomprehensible," he told Högel. "I felt like an accountant of death, addressing the scale of what the court had spent months documenting." Biermann added, "The fact is, sometimes the worst fantasy is not enough to describe the truth." He apologized directly to the families in the courtroom for the 15 counts the court had been unable to resolve, telling them plainly that prosecutors and judges alike had been unable to shine light through part of the fog that hung over the entire case. Given the severity of the crimes, the court's ruling also flagged that any future parole review would need to weigh the exceptional gravity of what Högel had done, a notation that will likely keep him behind bars for the remainder of his life, regardless of Germany's standard parole timelines. Between his 2008, 2015, and 2019 convictions combined, Niels Högel has now been found responsible for 85 confirmed murders, making him modern Germany's most prolific serial killer and one of the deadliest documented healthcare killers anywhere in the world. Investigators believe the true number could be dramatically higher still, with some estimates suggesting Högel may have killed as many as 200 to 300 patients across his 6-year career, a figure that will likely never be confirmed given how much physical evidence was lost to cremation and time before anyone thought to look for it. If that higher estimate is even approximately accurate, it would place Högel's true body count well above every other case in this episode, a number made only more disturbing by how ordinary and unremarkable his working life looked from the outside for almost the entire span of it. A well-liked nurse, a father, a man with a glowing reference letter in his file, quietly responsible for one of the largest unsolved death tolls in modern European history for years longer than anyone realized. Perhaps the most unsettling detail in the entire case isn't the body count. It's the 2001 meeting. Hospital staff had the statistical evidence in front of them, a clear majority of a ward's worst outcomes clustering around one employee's shifts, discussed openly, with that employee present in the room. And still, nothing changed. He received a commendation letter the following year, praising his composure in exactly the kind of critical situations he himself was manufacturing. He was allowed to transfer to a second hospital with his reputation fully intact, reference letter in hand. It would take another 4 years, another hospital, and finally a colleague catching him with her own eyes, tampering with a syringe pump in real time, before anyone called the police at all. And even then, it took 2 more days and 1 more death before that call was actually made. In the years since, German prosecutors have pursued charges against some of Högel's former colleagues and supervisors, arguing that their failure to act, even in the face of statistics that all but named him, carried its own criminal weight. Several individuals connected to the Delmenhorst clinic were investigated for negligent manslaughter, based on allegations that they had witnessed suspicious behavior, including at least one instance of a colleague reportedly observing Högel inject a patient with a cardiac drug without taking the kind of immediate action that might have ended the killings years sooner. The prosecutions of those bystanders proved far more legally complicated than the case against Högel himself, since proving criminal negligence requires showing that a person's inaction directly and foreseeably enabled a specific death, a much higher bar than showing they simply should have said something sooner. Some of those proceedings dragged on for years after Högel's own case had already concluded, a slow reckoning with the fact that catching a healthcare serial killer often depends less on forensic science than on the willingness of ordinary co-workers to say something uncomfortable out loud and act on it immediately rather than quietly, privately, after the fact. Whatever the outcome of those individual cases, the broader inquiry into Högel's crimes concluded that the hospitals themselves bore significant institutional responsibility, not for missing the pattern entirely, but for recognizing it and choosing not to act on what they saw. It's a pattern that echoes uncomfortably closely with Charles Cullen's story on the other side of the Atlantic. Not a killer who was especially difficult to detect, but a series of institutions that noticed, hesitated, and moved on. Both men worked for well over a decade combined. Both left behind a body count nobody can state with total confidence, because too many records were destroyed, too many bodies cremated, too much time allowed to pass before anyone treated the pattern as more than an unfortunate statistic. The tools that eventually caught both men, a hidden wire in one case, a colleague's direct eyewitness account in the other, arrived only after each system's ordinary safeguards had already failed for years. Not every case in this list involves a killer working quietly for years before anyone raised an alarm, or a hospital that noticed and chose to look away. The next case moves to Massachusetts, where a nurse's motive had almost nothing to do with boredom or the admiration of her colleagues, and everything to do with a relationship investigators say she was determined to keep, no matter how many patients it cost her along the way. Where Högel wanted an audience for his own heroism, this next case is built around wanting the attention of one particular man and being willing to manufacture a crisis every time she feared she might be losing it. When investigators finally closed in on her, Kristen Gilbert didn't run, and she didn't turn herself in. She picked up a phone and called in a fake bomb threat to the very hospital where she worked, hoping to derail the people closing in on her before they could finish connecting the pattern that had already started pointing at her name. Kristen Heather Strickland was born on November 13th, 1967, and grew up in relative affluence in the Massachusetts suburbs. A former neighbor would later describe her in the ordinary language people use about kids who seem headed somewhere good, as decent, normal, pretty intelligent, and sharp. She excelled at school and belonged to the math club, graduating high school a full year and a half early with high grades across the board. Other accounts from people who knew her growing up paint a more troubling picture underneath that surface. Family, friends, and former classmates described her as a habitual liar, prone to staging fake suicide attempts to manipulate the people around her, and at least one report claims she falsely told people she was related to Lizzie Borden, the notorious 19th century murder suspect. She married Glenn Gilbert in 1988, and the couple went on to have 2 sons together. According to Glenn's own later account, at one point during their marriage, he grew suspicious that his wife might be trying to poison him after noticing his food tasting strange. A search of their home turned up a book titled The Handbook of Poisoning, tucked into a kitchen cupboard. She was never prosecuted over that suspicion. In March 1989, she joined the nursing staff at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, assigned to work Ward C. The following year, in April 1990, she was featured in a magazine called VA Practitioner, held up as an example of the kind of nurse the hospital was proud to employ. Around that same period, the Northampton Vamp began experiencing a troubling rise in fatal heart attacks, almost all of them occurring in Ward C, the very ward where Gilbert worked. Other nurses noticed the pattern well before anyone raised it formally. For a while, they simply joked about it, giving Gilbert a nickname that would later look almost unbearably prescient, the Angel of Death. Prosecutors would eventually determine that during Gilbert's 7 years at the hospital, she had been on duty for close to half of the roughly 350 deaths recorded in Ward C during that span. A statistical coincidence so extreme that one Boston Globe account described it as almost impossible. What Gilbert was doing, according to the case prosecutors eventually built, was injecting patients' intravenous lines with unauthorized doses of epinephrine, the synthetic form of adrenaline used in genuine emergencies to restart a failing heart, in the wrong dose, at the wrong moment. Epinephrine sends a healthy heart racing wildly out of control before causing it to stop entirely. It was also, conveniently for someone trying not to get caught, a drug that left little detectable trace in a patient's body once metabolized, at least using the toxicology methods available at the time. The 4 murders that would eventually reach a jury involved 4 military veterans under Gilbert's care. Stanley Jagodowski, a 66-year-old Army veteran, killed in August 1995. Henry Hudon, a 35-year-old Air Force veteran, killed that December. Kenneth Cutting, a 41-year-old Army veteran who was blind and living with multiple sclerosis, killed in early February 1996. And Edward Squire, a 69-year-old World War II Army veteran, killed less than 2 weeks after Cutting. In Cutting's case specifically, prosecutors allege something almost casually chilling. Gilbert had asked a supervisor for permission to leave her shift early that day, mentioning that a very ill patient might die soon. Cutting died about 40 minutes later. Empty ampules of epinephrine were later found near his body. Investigators would later allege a documented history of violence and manipulation stretching back years before the murders. They pointed to an assault involving a large kitchen knife in Greenfield, Massachusetts, sometime in early 1988, before Gilbert had even become a nurse. They alleged that on January 30th, 1994, she deliberately caused a medical emergency by removing a patient's breathing tube at the VA hospital, and they alleged that in November 1995, she twice attempted to murder a patient by poisoning. Underlying all of it, prosecutors argued, was a motive far more personal and in some ways far more mundane than any of the other cases in this episode. Gilbert had begun a relationship with James Perot, a VA police officer stationed at the same hospital. Under hospital policy, any medical emergency required a police officer to respond alongside medical staff. Every code Gilbert called, in other words, guaranteed that Perot would walk through the door. Prosecutors would later argue, bluntly, that Gilbert created life-threatening emergencies specifically to summon him, to showcase her own competence in the chaos she'd manufactured, and to keep himself and her colleagues watching her perform the role of the nurse who saves lives, again and again, for an audience that had no idea the crisis itself was staged. A hospital psychiatrist, who served as chief of staff at the time, William Boutelle, later offered his own theory along similar lines, that Gilbert created these emergencies specifically to display her proficiency as a nurse in front of the people whose attention she wanted most, using other people's cardiac arrests as a stage for a performance only she understood was scripted. The joke among colleagues didn't survive contact with the actual numbers. Investigators would later suspect Gilbert's true total might run considerably higher than the 4 murders eventually proven in court, with some estimates floated during the investigation suggesting a number as high as 60, though prosecutors were only ever able to build a provable case around a handful of specific deaths. In February 1996, 3 nurses, Bonnie Bledsoe, Kathy Ricks, and a third colleague, went to hospital administrators with a formal warning. They'd noticed more than just a high death count. They'd noticed the hospital's epinephrine supply dwindling faster than any legitimate use could explain, and they connected that shortage specifically to the deaths of 2 patients, 41-year-old Kenneth Cutting and 69-year-old Edward Squeerer, both of whom had died suddenly and unexpectedly on Gilbert's watch. The hospital opened a formal investigation. Gilbert left her position that same year, in 1996, as the inquiry into the pattern of deaths intensified around her. That fall, she checked herself into psychiatric hospitals 7 separate times, staying anywhere from 1 to 10 days at a stretch, a pattern that would later become part of the broader picture investigators assembled of her state of mind during this period. During one of those stays, in July 1996, following a reported suicide attempt, Gilbert called Perot from inside the psychiatric ward and, according to an account he later gave, told him plainly, "You know I did it. I did it. You wanted to know. I killed those guys." It was as close to a direct confession as investigators would ever get, delivered not to police, but to the boyfriend prosecutors said had been her whole reason for doing it. Then, once she learned that Perot, her own boyfriend, was cooperating with the very investigators looking into her, Gilbert called in a bomb threat to the Northampton VAMC, an act investigators concluded was aimed squarely at retaliating against him and the co-workers who'd reported her. It didn't work as a distraction. It became, instead, a separate federal case entirely. In January 1998, Gilbert stood trial for the bomb threat alone and was convicted, sentenced to 15 months in prison, well before the murder case against her had even gone before a jury. The murder trial that followed was, by any measure, extraordinary. Because Gilbert's alleged crimes had taken place on federal property, at a VA hospital, prosecutors were legally able to pursue the death penalty under federal law, even though Massachusetts itself had abolished capital punishment at the state level back in 1984. It made Gilbert's case only the third time in the country's history that a federal capital murder trial had gone forward inside a state with no death penalty of its own, and it raised, for critics, a genuine question about whether that kind of jurisdictional maneuver was appropriate at all. The trial opened in Springfield, Massachusetts, in October 2000, and would stretch on for 5 months. Federal prosecutors William Welch and Ariane Vuono spent that time building what Welch himself called a compelling wall of guilt, calling nurses to testify about their years of accumulating suspicion, doctors to testify that the alleged victims had shown no clinical signs of being close to death, and toxicology experts to walk the jury through what elevated epinephrine actually does to a failing heart. Bonnie Bledsoe and Kathy Ricks, the two nurses who had first raised the alarm back in 1996, took the stand as key prosecution witnesses, along with James Perot himself, whose testimony about their relationship and about the phone call from the psychiatric ward became one of the trial's most closely watched moments. The defense, led by attorney David Hoose, countered by presenting Gilbert as a young, capable nurse simply doing her job, and called medical specialists of their own who argued the deaths were more consistent with natural causes. The case very nearly collapsed under its own evidentiary weight. On January 5, 2001, well into the trial, prosecutors were forced to admit that a toxicology lab had made an error in analyzing the epinephrine levels found in several victims' remains, results that had been central to establishing the medical basis for the murder charges in the first place. Under cross-examination, the defense's own chief medical expert conceded that while the deaths were most likely natural, anything is possible, a concession that cut both ways in a case already balanced on circumstantial evidence and statistical improbability rather than a single smoking gun. Judge Michael Ponsor gave the jury an unusually significant instruction as deliberations began. They were not required to limit themselves to a first-degree murder verdict. They could, if the evidence supported it, return a finding of second-degree murder instead, a conviction that still meant life in prison, but removed the possibility of execution entirely for that particular count. After 83 hours of deliberation spread across 12 days, the jury reached its verdict on March 14, 2001. They found Gilbert guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The distinction the jury drew between those 4 killings mattered enormously for what came next. Only the 3 first-degree counts left the death penalty legally on the table. During the penalty phase, prosecutors pushed hard for execution. Assistant U.S. Attorney William Welch called Gilbert a shell of a human being who deserved to die for what he described as the cold, calculating method she'd used against people who had trusted her completely. Gilbert's father and grandmothers pleaded with the jury for her life, arguing that a death sentence would devastate her two young sons, along with the rest of the family. Defense attorney Paul Weinberg offered the jury a different kind of argument entirely. "It is easier to incite good and decent people to kill," he said, "when their target is not human but a demon. Kristen Gilbert is not a monster, she is a human being." Victims' families were split on what they wanted to see happen next, a division that ran through nearly every family touched by the case. Nancy Cutting, widow of victim Kenneth Cutting, told reporters she'd be satisfied simply seeing Gilbert sit in jail for the rest of her life, rather than face execution, while other relatives openly hoped the jury would choose the opposite outcome. On March 26, 2001, after roughly 6 hours of deliberation on the penalty question alone, the jury declined to recommend death. Gilbert would have become only the third woman executed by the federal government in the past century, had they decided otherwise. The following day, Judge Ponsor formally sentenced her to 4 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years. She was transferred to FMC Carswell, a federal medical facility in Fort Worth, Texas, where she remains incarcerated today, having dropped a later appeal for a new trial once she learned prosecutors would be free to seek the death penalty again if she won it. What sets Gilbert's case apart from Cullen's and Högel's isn't just her motive, though the idea of manufacturing cardiac emergencies specifically to keep a boyfriend's attention is a genuinely unusual one within this category. It's that the system, this time, actually worked. Eventually, 3 nurses noticed a pattern, connected it to a specific and measurable shortage of medication, and took their suspicions directly to hospital leadership rather than simply distancing themselves or quietly warning each other the way colleagues had in Cullen's and Högel's stories. An investigation followed within the same year those suspicions were raised, not a decade later. Gilbert's own attempt to derail that investigation, the bomb threat meant to intimidate her boyfriend into silence, became the very thing that generated a separate federal conviction and paved the way toward the larger case against her. It's worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. Cullen and Högel were caught, eventually, but only after institutions that had every reason to act chose silence instead. For years, sometimes for over a decade, Gilbert was caught considerably faster, 7 years into her employment, rather than 16, because 3 co-workers refused to let an uncomfortable pattern go unspoken. It's not a perfect system. It still took years, still cost lives that earlier intervention might have saved, and it still required Gilbert to escalate into overt sabotage, a federal crime in its own right, before the full picture came into focus. But it stands, within this list, as the closest thing to an example of the process working the way it's supposed to. Not perfectly, not quickly enough, but at all. There's also something worth noting in how Gilbert's case ended up being prosecuted at all. Because her crimes happened on federal property, a jurisdictional quirk of working at a VA hospital rather than a private one, the case became a rare test of whether the federal government should be allowed to pursue a death sentence in a state that had rejected capital punishment for its own citizens decades earlier. That question never received a clean answer, since the jury ultimately chose life imprisonment over execution. But it left behind an unusual legal footnote: the government's willingness to reach past a state's own moral judgment on the death penalty, simply because the crime happened to occur on land the state didn't fully control. Not every nurse in this list needed a personal motive as specific as impressing a boyfriend, and not every one of them used a drug as difficult to trace as epinephrine, a substance that occurs naturally in the body and disappears from testing within hours under the wrong conditions. The next case moves to a Texas dialysis clinic, where the method wasn't a heart medication meant to save lives in the right dose. It was something found under nearly every kitchen sink in America, and unlike epinephrine, it left a trail investigators could follow almost immediately once they finally knew to look for it. For once in this episode, nobody needed a statistical model, a toxicology breakthrough, or a decade of hindsight to catch her. Two patients, both still hooked up to their own dialysis machines, watched her do it in real time, from only a few feet away, close enough to see exactly what was in her hand. Kimberly Clark Syons was born Kimberly Fowler on November 3, 1973, in Fall River, Massachusetts, and grew up mostly in Pollock, Texas, a small community just outside Lufkin, where she attended junior high and high school. She'd been a cheerleader as a younger student, part of the ordinary, unremarkable social fabric of a small East Texas town. Her junior year of high school, she learned she was pregnant by her boyfriend, gave birth that same year, and left Central High School without finishing. A common enough disruption that ended her formal education years earlier than most of her classmates. She eventually earned her high school equivalency and went on to Angelina College in Lufkin, where she completed the coursework to become a licensed vocational nurse, a credential that requires considerably less training than a registered nurse's degree, but still authorizes hands-on patient care under supervision. By 2007, she was working at a dialysis clinic in Lufkin, operated by DaVita, one of the largest kidney care companies in the entire country, treating patients with end-stage renal failure who relied on the clinic's machines several times a week simply to stay alive. She had been on the job roughly 8 months by the time the pattern of illness and death began. Dialysis patients are, by the nature of their illness, already medically fragile people living with a chronic, life-threatening condition. Cardiac events happen. Blood pressure crashes happen. It's part of what makes a dialysis floor a genuinely difficult place to notice when something is going wrong on purpose, rather than by the ordinary cruelty of kidney failure, which is exactly what made April of 2008 so alarming to the staff working alongside SENS. In under a month, patients at the clinic began coding at a rate nobody on staff had ever witnessed before, in a setting where, under normal circumstances, patients essentially never went into cardiac arrest at all during a routine treatment session. On April 1, 2008, 2 patients, Clara Strange and Thelma Metcalf, suffered cardiac arrest during treatment and died that same day. DaVita responded by sending a clinical coordinator named Amy Clinton to the Lufkin facility to oversee operations directly. It didn't stop anything. The problems continued even with a company supervisor physically present in the building, watching over the very shifts where patients kept getting sick. Paramedics responding to the growing number of emergency calls grew unnerved enough by the pattern that they raised concerns with their own superiors at the Lufkin Fire Department. One fire department official quietly reached out to state health inspectors, asking them to look into the clinic without telling DaVita directly that any such request had even been made. On April 26th, another patient, Opal Few, was found unresponsive during her treatment and died later that same day at the hospital. Then, on April 28, 2008, with state inspectors actually present and watching inside the clinic that very day, 2 more patients, Marva Rohn and Carolyn Reisinger, suffered severe drops in blood pressure during their treatments. This time, 2 fellow patients saw exactly what happened. Lurleen Hamilton, undergoing her own dialysis nearby, watched Sains place a bleach solution container on the floor, pour bleach from a bottle into it, and draw the mixture up into syringes. She saw Sains inject the bleach directly into Rohn's dialysis line, then repeat the entire process and inject a second syringe into Reisinger's line. Hamilton was frightened enough by what she'd witnessed to tell the clinic supervisor directly. "I'm a little nervous right now," she said, "and I'm worried because she's assigned to me." A second patient, Linda Hall, independently witnessed Sans fill another syringe and inject it into Rohn's line as well. Hall would later describe the moment in granular detail to investigators. "She took the syringe out of her pocket and squat down," Hall recalled, "and you could see her pulling back on the syringe, filling it up. I saw her go take the syringe and put it into Miss Rohn's IV tubing." Both women watched Sains dispose of the used syringes in the clinic's sharps containers afterward, then reported what they'd seen to supervisors within minutes of it happening. Reisinger's own husband, present in the clinic that day, reportedly began shouting out, asking what was wrong with his wife, as her condition suddenly worsened in front of him. When confronted by Amy Clinton about what the 2 patients had described, Sains offered an explanation that, on its face, wasn't entirely implausible. She said she'd been cleaning an unused dialysis machine and had used a syringe rather than a measuring cup to get a precise amount of bleach into the cleaning water, something she said made her feel more confident and careful given how closely everyone was already watching the clinic that month. It was against DeVita's own protocol, but it wasn't, by itself, an admission of anything criminal. Investigators tested the bucket Sains had been using anyway, along with the syringes recovered from the sharps container. Both came back positive for bleach residue in a context that didn't match her explanation. Police were called in. The clinic was shut down entirely for 2 months while investigators worked the scene. Sains was fired the following day, and her nursing license was suspended shortly after, in a detail that would later surface publicly and do her no favors. She applied for a receptionist position at another Lufkin medical office while out on bail, a violation of her release conditions. The investigation that followed drew in an unusually wide range of agencies working in tandem: local police, the Texas Attorney General's office, the CDC, and the FDA. A CDC epidemiologist assigned to the case ran the numbers the same way investigators in several of this episode's other cases eventually had to, and arrived at a conclusion that was hard to argue with statistically. Sains had been present at literally every incident in April where a patient died. Investigators also seized her home computer and found a search history that included queries for bleach poisoning, and more specifically, whether bleach could be detected in dialysis lines at all. Searches conducted, according to prosecutors, before the wave of April deaths had fully run its course. When Sains later testified before a grand jury, she offered her own explanation for those searches. She said she'd grown concerned about the pattern of patient deaths herself and had looked up bleach poisoning to understand what symptoms it might cause, in case that turned out to be what was happening at the clinic. Blood and tissue samples from the suspected victims were sent off for specialized testing and came back showing chlorotyrosine, a stable biological marker that indicates a person's blood was exposed to bleach, evidence that gave prosecutors a scientific foundation entirely independent of the two eyewitness accounts. Investigators and prosecutors eventually settled on a working theory of motive, though it remained more circumstantial than the physical evidence underpinning the murder charges themselves. Prosecutors described Saenz during the investigation as a depressed and disgruntled employee, someone who had complained openly about specific patients, including some of the very people who would later be counted among her victims or survivors. One criminologist featured in a later television special offered a blunter characterization, describing Saenz as someone effectively dispatching patients as an act of revenge against her employer, driven by feeling overworked and unappreciated in a job she could not simply walk away from. It's a very different psychological profile from Kristen Gilbert's relationship-driven crimes, or Niels Högel's hunger for an admiring audience. If prosecutors were right, Saenz wasn't performing for anyone. She was, in effect, taking out frustration with her workplace on the people least able to protect themselves from it. Saenz was formally charged roughly a year after her firing, and the case moved slowly toward trial, delayed by pre-trial motions and legal wrangling for nearly 4 years before jury selection finally began in March 2012. The trial itself ran 18 days. Prosecutors built their case around the 5 deaths and 3 additional injuries they could support with both eyewitness testimony and the chlorotyrosine evidence. The deaths of Thelma Metcalf, Garland Kelly, Opal Few, Clara Strange, and Cora Bryant, and the injuries of Marva Roan, Deborah Oates, and Marie Bradley. Saenz's defense argued, at length, that she was being scapegoated for the clinic's own operational failures, pointing to DeVita's water purification system and suggesting the real cause of the April crisis had been chemical contamination the company didn't want to admit to. Prosecutors dismissed the theory outright. District Attorney Clyde Harrington later put it plainly: if contaminated water had been the actual cause, every patient in the building would have gotten sick, not a specific, rotating handful of individuals whose timing happened to align precisely with Saenz's own shifts. Saenz did not take the stand in her own defense. After 4 weeks of testimony and 2 days of jury deliberation, on March 30th, 2012, the jury found her guilty of capital murder in the deaths of the 5 patients, along with 3 counts of aggravated assault for the survivors. Family members of victims lined up afterward to thank the district attorney personally, many of them having sat through the entire month-long trial, reliving the worst day of their own lives in a courtroom, day after day. Carla Mott, the daughter of murder victim Cora Bryant, embraced her nephew as the verdicts were read, the culmination of nearly 4 years of waiting for a jury to formally say what she had believed since the week her mother died. Marie Bradley, one of the surviving victims, had no memory at all of the day she was injected, and told reporters the verdict finally gave her the confirmation she'd spent 4 years hoping for. "I've just been in limbo, hoping and praying they would get on with it," she said. "This gives me relief and a sense of closure." Because the charge was capital murder, Saenz faced the possibility of a death sentence when the case moved to its punishment phase. Prosecutors had said from the outset They intended to seek execution, a decision that meant the same jury that had just convicted her would now have to decide, separately, whether she should live or die. Her own defense attorney, Steve Taylor, argued the opposite in his closing statement, telling jurors plainly that a life sentence would accomplish everything a death sentence could, without the additional years of automatic appeals a capital sentence would guarantee. "She's never getting out no matter what you do," he said. "Society is protected. You will never see her again," he reminded jurors, pointedly, that Sáenz had remained free on bail throughout the entire trial, a fact he suggested undercut any argument that she posed an ongoing danger requiring the most severe punishment available. On April 2, 2012, the jury agreed, sentencing Sáenz to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 20 years for each aggravated assault conviction. One family member, as the sentence was read, told her directly, "I hope you burn in hell." Sáenz appealed the conviction, and the case took an unusual detour through the Texas court system in the years that followed. Her attorneys argued that the jury instructions on the capital murder charge had been improper, since jurors were told they only needed to agree Sáenz had killed at least 2 of the 5 named victims, without needing to agree unanimously on which 2. It was a genuinely technical legal argument, the kind that has nothing to do with factual guilt or innocence, and everything to do with the precise wording a judge uses to instruct a jury before deliberations begin. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest court for criminal matters, agreed there was a legitimate legal question there and sent the case back down for further review, a process that stretched the total appeals timeline out by several more years. In August 2015, the Fourth Court of Appeals in San Antonio ultimately affirmed both the conviction and the life sentence, closing out an appeals process that had dragged on for years after the original verdict. Sáenz, from prison, continued to insist publicly that her conviction was unjust, writing in one letter posted to a website supporting her release that she believed it was better for a guilty person to walk free than for an innocent person's freedom to be taken. Sáenz has never stopped publicly maintaining her innocence. In interviews given years after her conviction, including one for a televised true crime special, she insisted that harming another person was, in her words, simply not in my nature, and repeated her original defense that DeVita's own procedural failures, not her own actions, were behind what happened at the clinic that April. Criminologists and the case's original investigators have been equally unequivocal in rejecting that account. As one investigator put it at the time, once inspectors traced the presence of bleach in the lines back to the specific moments each dose was administered, every trail led to the same conclusion: Sáenz had personally been the one giving it. What separates Sáenz's case from nearly everything else in this episode isn't the method, dramatic as bleach injections are, but the speed. Cullen operated for 16 years, Högel for 6, Gilbert for the better part of a decade. Sáenz's documented killing spree lasted less than a month, cut short not by a wire, a family tree, or a decade-old statistical review, but by 2 patients who happened to be positioned well enough and brave enough to watch it happen and say something immediately. It's a reminder that not every one of these cases requires forensic innovation to solve. Sometimes it just requires someone in the room refusing to look away, and a system willing to believe them the moment they spoke up. There's a harder question sitting underneath that reassurance, though. Sayans was stopped quickly because her method was clumsy and visible, carried out in an open treatment area in front of alert, conscious patients, rather than behind a curtain or inside a locked medication room. Cullen and Högel worked in environments where their actions were, by comparison, almost invisible, isolated moments inside a hospital room with an unconscious or sedated patient and no other witness capable of describing what they'd seen. It raises an uncomfortable possibility that some of the difference between a killer caught in a month and a killer caught after 16 years has less to do with how carefully investigators were watching and more to do with pure chance, whether or not there happened to be another set of eyes in the room at the exact moment it mattered. Not every nurse in this list needed to be caught in the act at all. The next case moves to Canada, where a killer who'd been getting away with it for nearly a decade wasn't identified through a witness, a statistical anomaly, or a family tree. She simply decided, on her own, to tell someone the truth, in a room that had nothing to do with a hospital, a courtroom, or a police interrogation, and everything to do with her own conscience finally giving out. In September 2016, a woman checked herself into a Toronto addiction and mental health facility, struggling with a drug problem she'd carried, quietly, for over 2 decades. While there, she told a staff member something she had never told a single other person in 9 years. Not a doctor, not a colleague, not a police officer who'd never once had reason to ask her anything at all. Staff reported it immediately and without hesitation. By the end of that day, both the Toronto Police and Ontario's nursing regulator had been notified. Nobody had been looking for her, actively or otherwise. She simply decided, entirely on her own, to tell them. Elizabeth Wetlaufer was born Elizabeth Tracy May Parker on June 10, 1967, in Woodstock, Ontario, and raised there alongside her brother, in a household that, by outward appearances, gave no early indication of what was to come. In high school, where she went by Beta Parker and took part in band and choir, her yearbook entry described her hope to study drama at university, the kind of aspiration that reads, in hindsight, almost eerily beside the version of her the public would eventually come to know. Her path took a different turn. She trained as a nurse at Conestoga College, and by the time she started working in long-term care in 2007, she already had roughly a dozen years of nursing experience behind her, much of it involving exactly the kind of work that would later define her crimes, diagnosing blood sugar problems and administering insulin to patients who needed it. Her record wasn't clean even by then. She had been fired from an earlier hospital job after working a shift. While impaired by anti-anxiety medication, she'd admitted to stealing, a drug problem she would later tell investigators dated all the way back to 1995, the same year she first became a nurse, meaning the addiction and the career had, in effect, begun together and never fully separated since. In 2007, Wetlaufer was hired at Carissant Care, a long-term care facility in Woodstock, the same small city where she'd grown up. She often worked the overnight shift, frequently as the only nurse on duty for an entire wing of elderly residents. With sole access to 3 locked medication carts, and no one else present to notice what she withdrew from them, or why. It was, structurally, close to an ideal environment for exactly the kind of crime she went on to commit. Minimal oversight, vulnerable, and often cognitively impaired patients whose deaths could plausibly be attributed to age or underlying illness, and a medication, insulin, that was both readily available on the ward and notoriously difficult to detect after the fact once metabolized. Two of her earliest patients, sisters-in-law Clotilda Adriano and Albina de Medeiros, happened to be diabetics, a detail that, according to statements Wetlaufer later gave police, planted the idea in her mind in the first place. Between June and December of 2007, she injected both women with insulin they had no medical reason to receive. Neither dose proved fatal that year, though both women would die years later of unrelated causes. Police would eventually charge Wetlaufer with aggravated assault over those two injections, rather than murder, since investigators couldn't tie their eventual deaths directly back to what she'd done years earlier. Her first fatal act came 3 months into her time at Kerasant. On August 11, 2007, Wetlaufer was assigned to look after James Silcox, an 84-year-old Second World War veteran and father of 6, who had lost his mobility to a stroke and, that particular night, was agitated, disoriented, and repeatedly calling out for his late wife, Agnes. Wetlaufer later described what happened inside her as a red surge, a feeling, she said, made her angry at Silcox and made her want him to die, an explanation investigators and the eventual public inquiry would treat with considerable skepticism, given how consistently it recurred across 9 years and 8 separate victims. Around 9:30 that evening, she walked to the medication room, loaded an insulin pen, and injected him with 50 units of fast-acting insulin, twice the dose she'd used on Adriano and de Medeiros months earlier. Silcox died at 3 in the morning. The doctor on call attributed it to a post-surgical embolism, and no autopsy was performed, despite the death being flagged to the local coroner as unexpected, a gap that would allow the true cause to go entirely undetected for nearly a decade. Wetlaufer herself filled out the paperwork documenting his death. It would be 9 long years before Silcox's family learned any different. His son would later say he first heard his father's death had become a murder investigation on the radio, with no warning from police beforehand, and no reason, until that moment, to ever have questioned what he'd been told back in 2007. The killing continued at Kerasant Care for years, largely unremarked upon by the institution around her, spread out just widely enough in time that no single death ever seemed alarming on its own. Maurice Granath, 84, died in December 2007. Gladys Millard, 87. Helen Matheson, 95. Mary Zurawinski, 96. Helen Young, 90. And Maureen Pickering, 79. Followed over the next 6 years, each killed the same way, with insulin no doctor had prescribed, administered by a nurse whose access to the medication cart was never seriously questioned by anyone above her. Elderly residents in long-term care die, with some regularity, as a simple matter of age and underlying illness, and that baseline expectation of mortality became, in effect, Wetlaufer's camouflage, a death that might have triggered scrutiny in a maternity ward or a pediatric unit, barely registered as unusual on a geriatric one. In her personal life during this period, Wetlaufer's relationship with her partner deteriorated under the weight of heavy drinking on both sides, and the two split within a year of moving in together, one more source of the overwhelmed and angry state she would later describe to police as the backdrop to nearly everything she did during these years. It was only days after Maureen Pickering's murder, in March 2014, that Crescent Care finally fired Wetlaufer, and even then, not explicitly for the murders themselves. The stated reason was a medication error, giving insulin to the wrong patient, in an incident that, this time, wasn't fatal. Crescent's own termination form flagged that Wetlaufer's behavior was placing residents at risk, and the home did send that information to the College of Nurses of Ontario, the profession's regulatory body. The college, in turn, told Crescent Care that its review would remain confidential, and the nursing home was never informed of what, if anything, the college eventually decided to do about it. Crescent also paid Wetlaufer $2,000 and provided a reference letter stating she had left for personal reasons, a decision made partly to head off a potential grievance from the nurses' union representing her. Nothing in that arrangement warned any future employer about what Crescent Care itself had already flagged as a life-threatening pattern. Wetlaufer's next job came quickly, a matter of weeks rather than months, with nothing standing between one facility's silence and the next facility's trust. She was hired at Meadow Park, a nursing home in nearby London, Ontario, arriving with what colleagues later described as glowing references. She was well liked, a good worker who loved to mentor and teach. None of it mentioned the disciplinary history Crescent Care had documented, the medication errors, the maltreatment complaints, or the reason she'd actually left her previous job, because none of that information had ever been required to follow her. In August 2014, Wetlaufer killed her eighth and final confirmed victim at Meadow Park, 75-year-old Arpad Horvath, using the same method she'd relied on for 7 years by that point. She would go on to attempt to harm several more patients over the following 2 years, at additional care facilities, and eventually inside a private home where she also worked as a caregiver, though those later victims survived, and those incidents ultimately became the 4 attempted murder and 2 aggravated assault charges added to the 8 murder counts she would eventually face. By the time she admitted herself to Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in September 2016, Wetlaufer had been killing and harming patients, on and off, for 9 years, across multiple institutions, without a single external investigation ever coming close to identifying her. What finally happened wasn't the result of a whistleblower, a statistical anomaly flagged by an administrator, or a colleague's suspicion reported up a chain of command. It was Wetlaufer, in treatment for her own addiction, telling a staff member the truth, entirely on her own initiative. That staff member reported it immediately, setting off a police investigation that moved unusually fast, precisely because the person under investigation had already told them almost everything they needed to know. Wetlaufer was formally charged in October 2016, with additional charges filed in January 2017, covering the earlier, non-fatal insulin injections given to Adriano and Demideros back in 2007. In June 2017, she pleaded guilty in a Woodstock courtroom to 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Under direct questioning from the presiding judge, Justice Bruce Thomas, Wetlaufer confirmed she had not been intoxicated by drugs or alcohol at the time of any of the injections, and confirmed she had known each dose could prove fatal when she administered it. Her own account of her motivation, given in videotaped confessions later shown in court, offered little in the way of a conventional explanation. She described feeling overwhelmed and angry about her career, her responsibilities, and her life in general, and said she felt no particular ill will toward the specific people she killed. At her sentencing later that month, 28 victim impact statements had been submitted to the court, 19 of which were read aloud by grieving family members. Wetlaufer herself told the court she was extremely sorry. Arpad Horvath Jr., whose father had been her final victim, wasn't moved. "Maybe she understands the contempt and the hatred I have for her," he told reporters afterward. "I will never accept her apology." Justice Thomas sentenced Wetlaufer to 8 concurrent life terms, with no chance of parole, for 25 years. A joint submission from prosecutors and the defense that Thomas could have rejected in favor of a far harsher outcome. He noted explicitly that he could have ordered her sentences served consecutively instead of concurrently, a decision that would have pushed her total sentence past 200 years and made parole a practical impossibility regardless of the 25-year minimum. He chose not to, telling the court he recognized that the public would almost certainly never have learned what Wetlaufer had done at all if she hadn't confessed on her own, and that this fact deserved some weight in how her cooperation was ultimately treated. Wetlaufer herself remained largely expressionless throughout the proceedings. Even as family members described, one after another, the particular grief of learning their loved one's ordinary death had actually been a murder. Shortly after the sentencing, the Ontario government announced an independent public inquiry into how the province's long-term care system had failed to catch her. It began the following year in St. Thomas, Ontario, not far from the Crescent Care Facility, where 7 of her 8 victims had died, and ran for roughly 4 months, hearing from surviving victims, families, advocacy groups, and healthcare organizations. Wetlaufer herself was not compelled to testify. The commission concluded there was little left to learn from her directly, given how thoroughly she had already confessed. When Commissioner Eileen Gilles released the inquiry's final report on July 31st, 2019, her central finding was almost impossible to read as anything other than a full indictment of the entire system Wetlaufer had operated inside for nearly a decade. The evidence in this inquiry shows that nothing would have triggered an investigation into Wetlaufer, Gilles told the families and officials gathered for the report's release, or the incidents underlying the offenses. The commissioner also directly rejected any suggestion that Wetlaufer's crimes might have been a form of mercy killing, born from compassion for suffering patients, a theory some had floated publicly in the years between her confession and the report's release. She had killed, Gilles concluded flatly, for her own gratification and for no other reason. James Silcox's daughter, Andrea, put the inquiry's broader findings into plainer terms afterward, speaking not just for her own family, but for everyone touched by the case. "This wasn't the fault of one person," she said. "This was the fault of the system. It wasn't just Wetlaufer that is to blame for this whole thing. She was given the opportunity to do these things by people brushing her previous issues under the table." What makes Wetlaufer's case genuinely unlike anything else in this episode isn't the method. Insulin overdoses aren't unique to her story, but the total absence of external detection at any point across 9 years and multiple institutions. Cullen was eventually flagged by a computerized medication tracking system. Högel was caught red-handed by a colleague. Gilbert was reported by co-workers who noticed a suspicious pattern in a shrinking epinephrine supply. Sayens was witnessed directly by two of her own patients, in real time, from a few feet away. Wetlaufer had none of that. No statistical anomaly ever triggered a review. No colleague ever formally raised an alarm loud enough to reach police. The single termination that did occur was quietly absorbed by a confidential regulatory process and a severance agreement designed, in part, to avoid a labor dispute. And it changed nothing about her ability to find her next job within weeks. References intact, disciplinary history invisible. If Elizabeth Wetlaufer hadn't walked into a treatment facility of her own accord and decided to tell someone the truth, Ontario's official public inquiry concluded, in as many words, that she might still be working today, quietly moving between long-term care facilities with a reputation nobody had any real reason to question. There's a bleak kind of logic underneath that finding. Every other case in this episode eventually depended on somebody outside the killer noticing something. A statistic, a syringe, a suspicious pattern of requests, a direct line of sight to the act itself. Wetlaufer's case depended on nothing external at all. The entire regulatory and institutional apparatus, meant to protect elderly, often cognitively impaired residents in long-term care, simply never generated a single signal worth investigating. Not across 9 years, not across 3 facilities and a private home, not across 8 deaths that a coroner, in at least one case, was explicitly told were unexpected. The system didn't fail to catch a clever killer who covered her tracks expertly. It failed to build any mechanism capable of catching an uncovered one at all. Not every case in this list ends with a system that failed quite so completely, or a killer who turned herself in with nothing forcing her hand but her own conscience and a stint in addiction treatment. The final case tonight moves to England, to a hospital ward where the patients were far too young to protect themselves, and where a nurse's crimes would ultimately change how an entire country thinks about who's allowed to work, unsupervised, among the most vulnerable people in any hospital. Doctors on a children's ward in Lincolnshire first raised the formal possibility of deliberate insulin poisoning among their patients in early April 1991. Police weren't called for 18 more days. That gap, more than any single act committed during it, would go on to define one of the most closely scrutinized institutional failures in the history of Britain's National Health Service. Beverly Allett was born in 1968 in Corby Glen, Lincolnshire, to a working-class family. From adolescence onward, she had an extensive documented history of fabricating and exaggerating illness in herself, a pattern consistent with what clinicians call Munchausen syndrome. She was known to self-harm, to wear bandages and dressings over wounds that didn't exist, and to move between doctors frequently enough that local general practitioners became familiar with the pattern well before she ever became a nurse. At one point, she underwent the removal of an appendix that was later found to have been entirely healthy, and she was said to have deliberately interfered with the surgical wound afterward to keep it from healing. Colleagues and instructors who knew her during this period would later describe a pattern of attention-seeking behavior that, in isolation, seemed troubling but ultimately manageable, the kind of thing that raised quiet concern without ever rising to a level that blocked her professional path forward entirely. She struggled to complete her nursing qualification on schedule, missing a significant amount of coursework due to her frequent absences, and ultimately trained as a state-enrolled nurse, a now discontinued category of nursing credential that required less clinical training than a full registered nurse's qualification. Despite that history, in February 1991, Grantham and Kesteven General Hospital hired her on a temporary 6-month contract to work on Ward 4, the hospital's children's ward, a position that existed largely because the ward was short-staffed enough to be operating, in the words of a later official inquiry, on the borderline of viability. Over the following 59 days, a cluster of unexplained medical emergencies began occurring among patients on Ward 4, infants and young children who suffered sudden, unexplained collapses, cardiac events, and respiratory crises far more often and far more severely than the ward's ordinary caseload would predict. In a unit built to treat routine childhood illness and minor injury, the sheer frequency of genuine emergencies quickly became difficult for staff to explain through normal clinical reasoning alone. The pattern that eventually drew scrutiny wasn't any single incident, but its recurrence. Doctors began to notice that these unexplained emergencies were consistently occurring while one particular nurse was on duty, and that they stopped happening whenever she was reassigned away from a given patient, or when a child was transferred to a different hospital entirely. It was the kind of correlation that, once named aloud, seems almost impossible to miss in hindsight, and yet took weeks of slowly accumulating incidents before any single doctor connected it explicitly and said so out loud to a colleague. 4 children ultimately died during this period: 7-month-old Liam Taylor, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, 2-month-old Becky Phillips, and 15-month-old Claire Peck. Several more children were seriously injured, and investigators would eventually connect a total of 13 separate incidents to Allitt's shifts on the ward. The medical evidence, once investigators started actively looking for it, was more straightforward to establish than the pattern had been to notice in the first place. Elevated and medically unexplained levels of insulin and potassium showed up in blood tests taken from several of the affected children. Unexplained puncture marks were found in locations inconsistent with any treatment the children had actually been prescribed. Investigators later determined Allitt had used a range of methods to cause the emergencies she then responded to, including unauthorized medication and, in some instances, deliberately obstructing a child's ability to breathe. Methods that left behind the kind of physical evidence a careful forensic review could eventually trace back to specific dates and specific shifts. Even once hospital doctors began actively suspecting insulin poisoning in early April 1991, formally notifying the police took another 18 days, a delay Sir Cecil Clothier's later independent inquiry would single out by name as one of the case's most serious institutional failures. During that entire window, Allitt continued working on the ward without any restriction on her access to patients. Once Lincolnshire police did become involved, the investigation moved with considerably more urgency than the hospital's internal response had. Investigators searched Allitt's home and recovered missing nursing logs connected to all 13 victims, records that had gone unaccounted for during the hospital's own internal review, along with keys to the ward's insulin fridge that had also gone missing during the relevant period. In November 1991, roughly 7 months after the last of the 13 incidents, Allitt was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and grievous bodily harm. She gave police almost nothing to work with directly, answering no comment to the overwhelming majority of questions put to her during multiple rounds of formal interviews, and never offered any confession or explanation for what investigators had found in her home or in the hospital's own records. Alet's trial opened at Nottingham Crown Court in February 1993 and stretched on for 3 full months, one of the longest and most closely watched criminal trials in the country at that time. Prosecutors built their case largely around presence and pattern, rather than any single piece of direct evidence. Alet, they showed, had been on duty for every one of the 13 incidents, and the emergencies reliably stopped whenever she was removed from a ward or a child was moved elsewhere for treatment. It was, in essence, the same statistical logic that would eventually catch several of the killers in this episode. Presence correlated too tightly with harm to be coincidence, laid out methodically for a jury rather than uncovered by an epidemiologist or a computerized medication log. Medical experts walked the jury through the toxicology findings and the physical evidence recovered from the children's charts and bodies, connecting specific unexplained drug levels and injection sites to specific shifts Alet had worked. A pediatric expert who testified for the prosecution described her behavior as consistent with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a term now more commonly referred to clinically as factitious disorder imposed on another, used to describe a caregiver who fabricates, exaggerates, or directly causes illness in someone under their care, typically in order to receive attention or sympathy from medical staff and family members responding to the resulting crisis. Alet herself never explained her actions in court and offered the jury no version of events beyond a blanket denial. She pleaded not guilty throughout and maintained that plea for the entirety of the trial, declining to testify in her own defense. On May 28, 1993, after several days of jury deliberation, Alet was convicted on all 13 counts, 4 charges of murder, 3 of attempted murder, and 6 of causing grievous bodily harm. She sat with her eyes down for most of the hearing and showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. Justice David Latham sentenced her to 13 concurrent life terms, with a minimum term of 30 years before any possibility of parole, describing her as a cunning, manipulative individual who had shown no remorse and who presented no realistic prospect of ever being safely released. He told the court that her crimes had condemned the families of the dead and injured children to what amounted to a life sentence of their own, one from which there would be no remission and no release on license, ever. Parents of the children she'd killed and injured spoke to reporters outside the courthouse afterward, describing a mixture of relief and a grief that a verdict, however complete, could do nothing to actually resolve. A week into her sentence, Alet stopped eating and drinking and was transferred out of the standard prison system entirely to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Nottinghamshire, where she has remained ever since. Her 30-year minimum expired in the early 2020s, opening the door to a formal review process, though her continued placement in a secure psychiatric hospital rather than a mainstream prison means any parole consideration requires additional clinical assessment first, and as of recent reporting, her case had not yet been formally referred to the parole board. Families of her surviving victims have continued to speak publicly against any future release. One father, whose daughter suffered lasting brain damage in one of the attacks, told a local newspaper decades later that his family still feared what might happen if Alet were ever freed, insisting a life sentence should mean exactly that. In 2018, Allitt was hospitalized with a serious case of sepsis and was, according to reporting at the time, considered to be in genuine danger of dying from the infection. She survived. What happened after Allitt's conviction may ultimately be as consequential as the case itself. In May 1993, immediately following the verdicts, the government commissioned an independent inquiry, chaired by Sir Cecil Clothier, to examine exactly how the healthcare system had allowed the pattern to continue as long as it did. Clothier's team met 35 times over the following months, interviewed 94 witnesses directly, and reviewed extensive written submissions and hospital records before publishing its findings in February 1994. The resulting report was blunt about the hospital's institutional failures, criticizing breakdowns in management and communication at Grantham and Kesteven, and specifically highlighting the 18-day gap between the first serious suspicion of insulin poisoning and the moment police were finally brought in. It also documented long-standing understaffing on the ward that predated Allitt's hiring entirely, a structural vulnerability the report connected directly to the conditions that let a temporary, inadequately vetted employee gain the kind of unsupervised access to vulnerable patients that the case ultimately turned on. Correspondence between doctors on the ward, reviewed as part of the inquiry, had flagged shortages of emergency equipment well before the crisis began. Warnings the report found had gone largely unheeded at the time. At the same time, the inquiry explicitly declined to conclude that Allitt could easily have been identified or stopped sooner, a finding that struck some of the victims' families and at least one journalist who examined the report closely as an uncomfortably convenient way to spread institutional blame thin enough that no single failure had to bear the full weight of it. Critics of the inquiry's scope also noted that Clothier had agreed, at the outset, to limit his examination specifically to the immediate hospital response, rather than the broader question of NHS understaffing and underfunding that had helped create the conditions Allitt was hired into in the first place, a limitation some families felt let the system as a whole off comparatively lightly. The reforms that followed touched the broader NHS system, not just the one hospital involved. Responsibility for paediatric services at Grantham was transferred entirely to a different NHS trust based in Nottingham. New consultant positions were created and filled specifically to address the staffing gaps the inquiry had identified, with 4 additional consultant paediatricians appointed in the years immediately following the report's publication. An earlier regional inquiry, commissioned by the Trent Regional Health Authority even before Clothier's report was finished, had already produced 51 separate recommendations, all of which the government confirmed had been acted upon by the time Clothier's findings were formally presented to Parliament in February 1994. Guidance on how hospitals should safeguard children in their care was substantially rewritten in the years that followed, incorporating lessons drawn directly from what had gone wrong on Ward 4, and professional nursing bodies conducted their own reviews of paediatric care guidelines in direct response to the case. More than 3 decades later, researchers and journalists examining an entirely different case, the 2023 conviction of neonatal nurse Lucy Letby for murdering infants in her care at a hospital in Chester, would return to the Clothier report and find something difficult to sit with, many of the same institutional patterns it had identified in 1994. Doctors noticing a suspicious cluster of incidents tied to one specific staff member, hesitation before escalating those concerns formally, and a costly delay before hospital management finally involved the police, appeared to repeat themselves almost exactly 3 decades and 1 country's worth of supposed reform later. At least one retired consultant psychiatrist who reviewed both cases in detail described troubling similarities in how each hospital's system responded once concerns were first raised internally, suggesting the specific written recommendations from 1994 had done less, in practice, to change the underlying culture of institutional hesitation than the report's authors likely intended. It's a sobering thought to end an episode on, that a set of formal reforms, adopted nationally and cited for years afterward as a turning point, may not have been enough, on their own, to prevent nearly the same failure from recurring inside a different hospital, a different generation of doctors, and a different decade entirely. It's worth stepping back, at the close of this episode, to look at what actually connects 6 cases spread across 4 countries and 3 decades. Charles Cullen exploited hospitals that valued their own legal exposure over a shared warning system, moving between 9 facilities over 16 years, while at least 4 of them suspected him and said nothing to the next one. Niels Högel was protected by colleagues and administrators who saw the statistical evidence laid out plainly in a meeting, with him sitting in the room, and still hesitated for years afterward. Kristen Gilbert was stopped only because 3 nurses refused to stay quiet about a shrinking supply of medication and a nickname that turned out to be far more literal than anyone intended. Kimberly Syons was caught because 2 patients happened to be watching at exactly the right moment, in an open room, in broad view. Elizabeth Wetlaufer worked for 9 years inside a system that never generated so much as a single formal red flag, moving between 3 facilities and a private home, and was only caught because she chose, entirely on her own, to confess during treatment for an unrelated addiction. And Beverly Allett was stopped only after a cluster of unexplained emergencies became too consistent to ignore, in a ward that had been left dangerously thin on staff long before she ever walked onto it, and even then, only after an 18-day delay that the country's own official inquiry singled out by name. None of these 6 cases needed a criminal mastermind. Not one of these 6 women was especially difficult to catch once someone actually looked. They needed, in every instance, an institution willing to look away from an uncomfortable pattern for just long enough, whether out of fear of liability, simple understaffing, professional courtesy extended to a colleague, or the plain human reluctance to believe that the person handing out medication at 2 in the morning might be the reason a patient stopped breathing. That's the thread running underneath every story in this episode, and it's the reason cases like these keep recurring, in different countries, different decades, and different wards, until the people responsible for noticing finally decide that noticing matters more than the discomfort of being the one to say something out loud. 6 women, 4 countries, nearly 40 years between the first case and the last, and in every single one, the pattern was there to be seen, well before anyone actually stopped to look.